Let's begin with something fundamental, yet often overlooked in the realm of texting and modern dating: over-texting. It may seem like a small thing, an innocent act of trying to stay connected, but beneath that surface lies something deeper, psychologically and philosophically, that speaks volumes about your sense of self-worth and your relationship with uncertainty. When you over-text someone, especially a man you're interested in, you're not just sending words, you're sending signals. You're broadcasting a message about your internal state, often unconsciously. Double texting, checking in repeatedly, asking if he got your last message. These are not neutral actions. They're a form of self-displacement, where you're shifting the burden of emotional regulation onto another person. And high-value men who are disciplined, purposeful, emotionally grounded, pick up on this immediately. Not necessarily on a conscious level, but intuitively. They feel the weight of that neediness, and it repels rather than attracts. Why? Because high-value men, by definition, are men who manage their own lives. They are not looking to parent a partner's anxiety. They are seeking someone who can manage uncertainty with poise, someone who has a strong internal locus of control. The minute your communication starts to center around, why hasn't he replied, or did I do something wrong? You've already shifted the dynamic. You've handed over your emotional center to someone else, and you've placed the responsibility for your security in his hands. And this is not a trivial mistake. It touches on something very old, something that runs deep in human psychology: the fear of abandonment. In many ways, overtexting is a digital manifestation of this primal fear. But here's the thing: when you try to soothe that fear by forcing connection, you don't reduce the anxiety, you amplify it. You train yourself to believe that your safety depends on his response, his attention, his approval. That's not a relationship. That's a one-sided negotiation with your own insecurity. Instead of flooding the space with words, allow for silence. Not as a manipulation tactic, but as a display of self-trust. Let the silence work in your favor. Let the unknown be a mirror that reflects your ability to hold space for ambiguity without falling apart. That's power. That's composure. And that's what high-value men notice: women who aren't afraid of a gap in conversation, who don't panic in the absence of immediate feedback. Remember, a high-value woman isn't chasing connection, she's choosing it. She texts not out of anxiety, but out of clarity. She initiates not to fill a void, but to express something meaningful. There's intention behind her words and restraint behind her timing. So next time you feel the urge to send that second text, stop. Ask yourself, am I trying to communicate or am I trying to control? Am I expressing interest or am I outsourcing my self-worth? The distinction matters. And if you want to attract a man of depth, of discipline, of value, then start by embodying those traits in your communication, not through volume, but through presence. Because ultimately, it's not the number of texts you send that defines you. It's the strength of the silence you're willing to hold. One of the most psychologically destabilizing texts you can send early in a connection is the classic, "What are we?" Now, let's not misunderstand. It's not that the question itself is wrong. Clarity, after all, is important in human relationships. But the timing and motivation behind that question often reveal far more about the person asking it than they realize. And this is where many women often unintentionally undermine the very connection they're trying to build. High-value men are attuned to subtext. They're not simply listening to your words, they're observing your orientation to the world. When you ask, "What are we?" too soon, before a foundation has been established, it signals something deeper: a low tolerance for ambiguity and a need for external validation to feel secure. The relationship hasn't yet matured into something real, but you're already trying to define it, lock it in before it's had a chance to reveal itself organically. It's also worth considering what motivates that question. Often, it's fear. Fear of wasting time, fear of emotional vulnerability, fear of abandonment. These are legitimate fears rooted in our evolutionary biology. For millennia, women have had more at stake reproductively, emotionally, and socially in the realm of pair bonding. But the solution isn't to grasp for certainty, it's to cultivate discernment and patience. Rushing the process doesn't protect you, it merely accelerates your own disappointment. High-value men, those with direction and emotional intelligence, are especially sensitive to this kind of anxiety. Not because they don't want commitment, but because they value alignment, and alignment requires time. These men are observing whether your interest in them is grounded in who they are or in your need to secure a label. If they sense that the relationship is being pursued more for what it represents than for the reality of the connection itself, they will disengage. You must ask yourself, am I building a bond or am I building a fantasy? Because if you're projecting a narrative onto someone before you've taken the time to truly understand them, then you're not in love with a person, you're in love with an outcome. Let the relationship breathe. Let it be messy and uncertain for a while. Observe how he shows up consistently, not just when things are easy. The man who is right for you will make his intentions known without being forced. But if you demand a definition before there's depth, you'll often lose both. So resist the urge to rush clarity. Hold the tension. Let the truth of the connection emerge rather than forcing it into shape. Because a relationship that is real doesn't need to be asked into existence. It becomes obvious through time, through actions, and through mutual respect. One of the most overlooked yet consequential texting mistakes is the tendency to turn your conversations into emotional dumping grounds. Specifically, using your phone as a place to constantly complain, vent, or express every emotional fluctuation you experience in real time. And while this may feel like authentic expression, it often becomes a subtle but corrosive form of emotional self-sabotage, especially when you're dealing with a high-value man. Now let's get something straight. Emotional expression is not weakness. In fact, genuine vulnerability, expressed at the right time and in the right context, can be profoundly connective. But there's a crucial difference between sharing your inner world and using someone else as a receptacle for your unresolved emotions. High-value men are not afraid of feelings, but they are highly attuned to emotional responsibility. They notice whether you are capable of regulating your state or whether you're outsourcing that responsibility onto them. You see, when your texts become filled with complaints about your day, your co-workers, your ex, your body, your friends, you're not just expressing yourself. You're framing your inner life as a constant problem in need of solving. And unless you're dealing with a man who needs to feel useful to feel wanted, which is a red flag in itself, you're unconsciously positioning yourself as emotionally unstable. You're reinforcing an identity of someone who is defined more by chaos than composure. Philosophically speaking, we might ask, what kind of partner are you signaling yourself to be? Because we are always signaling through our words, our tone, and our timing. When you lead with complaints, you're revealing that you're governed more by your immediate emotional impulses than by reflective insight. And that doesn't inspire trust, it inspires caution. This behavior, again, often stems from a deep yearning for connection. You want to be seen, you want to feel understood. But there's a paradox at play here. When you attempt to manufacture intimacy by exposing emotional distress too frequently or too early, you often achieve the opposite effect. You don't create closeness, you create overwhelm. High-value men, in particular, have cultivated discipline in their lives, mental, emotional, even spiritual. They are drawn to women who exhibit a similar capacity for internal order, not perfection, not stoicism, but a sense of personal sovereignty. When you're constantly texting about what went wrong or how upset you are, the implicit message is, I don't have this under control and I need you to hold it for me. That's not partnership, that's imbalance. And yes, a real relationship will eventually include space for emotional support. But the foundation of such a relationship is built on strength, not constant crisis. It's forged in mutual admiration, not pity or emotional dependency. So before you fire off that long paragraph about your terrible day, pause. Ask yourself, is this message about connection? Or is it about control? Am I inviting him into my world, or am I asking him to rescue me from it? Because in the end, the woman who commands respect is not the one who texts the most or vents the loudest. It's the one who knows when to speak and when to sit with her emotions long enough to make them worth sharing. One of the most psychologically damaging habits in modern communication, particularly in romantic dynamics, is the use of ultimatums or passive-aggressive messaging through text. On the surface, these messages might appear as attempts at asserting boundaries or clarifying expectations, but more often than not, they stem from a place of emotional volatility, masked control, and poorly managed fear. Let's look at the underlying mechanics. When you send a message like, if you don't want this, just say so, or maybe I should stop wasting my time, you're not inviting honest dialogue. You're leveraging emotional tension to provoke a response. It's not a request for clarity, it's a test. And here's the truth, high-value men don't play games with emotional blackmail. They don't respond well to manipulation, even when it's subtle or unconscious. Why? Because they've likely done the work to create internal order, and they recognize chaos when they see it. When a woman sends a passive-aggressive message, she is often trying to preempt rejection. She senses distance, uncertainty, or delay in a man's response. And instead of sitting with that discomfort, she launches a kind of emotional flare, hoping to force resolution. But this is not strength. It's a form of panic. It's the psyche overwhelmed by ambiguity, attempting to exert control over a reality it cannot accept. Philosophically, it's rooted in a refusal to face what is unknown and uncontrollable. There's a deeper irony at play here. The very behavior meant to secure closeness, threats, guilt trips, emotional ultimatums, actually produces the opposite effect. You don't make a man want to come closer by cornering him. You make him feel psychologically unsafe. You put him in a position where the only way to preserve his autonomy is to withdraw. And for a man of value, one who respects himself and others, that withdrawal isn't a punishment, it's a boundary. One of the more subtle but deeply revealing patterns in early stage romantic dynamics is the consistent act of always texting first. At first glance, it might seem harmless, an attempt to keep the connection alive, to show interest, to bridge silence with initiative. But underneath that pattern lies a psychological imbalance that speaks volumes about relational posture, self-worth, and the deeper need to be chosen rather than to pursue blindly. You see, when one person is always the initiator, always the one reaching out, keeping the dialogue alive, it creates an energetic asymmetry. That asymmetry isn't merely logistical, it reflects a deeper truth. The initiator often begins to carry more of the emotional weight, while the other person becomes increasingly passive, reactive, or even indifferent. High-value men, those who are disciplined, focused, and discerning, are especially perceptive of this. They won't always call it out explicitly, but they feel it. And what they feel is a woman who is too available, too eager, too invested, before they've even earned that level of access. It's important to understand that restraint isn't manipulation, it's dignity. Philosophically, it's the discipline of not giving more than the moment has earned. When you constantly text first, you are effectively saying my desire for connection overrides my need for reciprocity. You place yourself in the psychological posture of the pursuer, which is not inherently wrong, but becomes problematic when it's chronic and unreciprocated. You become the emotional engine of a one-sided dynamic. Now, this doesn't mean you should never initiate, but it does mean you should pay attention to the pattern. Is he initiating with equal energy? Is there balance? Is the pursuit mutual? Because if you're always the one keeping things alive, you're no longer co-creating a connection. You're sustaining a fantasy, often at your own expense. In evolutionary psychology, there's a principle often overlooked in modern dating. Value is signaled not only by what we offer, but by what we withhold until the right conditions are met. High-value men subconsciously assess whether you are responding to them, their character, their consistency, their essence, or whether you're simply filling an emotional void. If you don't leave space for him to step into the dynamic, to initiate, to pursue, he never gets the opportunity to reveal who he is in the relationship. You're not giving him the chance to rise. You're meeting him where he stands and then carrying the interaction from there. So instead of asking, why hasn't he texted me? Ask yourself, why am I the only one trying? That question cuts much deeper and offers far more insight. A man who values you will move towards you. He will communicate, pursue, initiate, not out of obligation, but from authentic interest. So the next time you feel compelled to text first, again, pause, leave space, let the silence do its work, because sometimes the clearest message you can send is none at all. Perhaps one of the most deceptively harmful texting behaviors in the context of high-value relationships is excessive validation, texting compliments, admiration, or praise too frequently and without calibration. At first, it seems generous, even sweet. A well-timed compliment can uplift, encourage, and strengthen connection. But when praise becomes excessive, unearned, or untethered to any observable reality, it stops being about connection and becomes a subtle form of self-abandonment. The psychological mechanics behind this are profound. When a woman continually validates a man, especially early on, it often signals more than kindness. It signals a craving to be seen, a subconscious hope that by building him up, he will in turn recognize her value. But this approach is flawed at its root. It creates an inverted power dynamic in which she becomes the emotional supplier and he the recipient of admiration he hasn't necessarily earned. And make no mistake, high-value men detect this pattern. They may not say it outright, but they notice when a compliment is rooted in genuine appreciation versus a deeper need for attention, approval, or reciprocation. It's the difference between saying, "I admire how grounded you are," and "You're so amazing. I don't know how you're still single." One reflects discernment, the other reflects pedestalization. And when you put someone on a pedestal, you shrink yourself in the process. Philosophically, the problem here lies in misplacing the source of value. You're communicating, often unintentionally, that his existence is more impressive than yours, that his presence must be constantly affirmed while yours waits silently in hope of being noticed. This is not love, it's worship. And in a relationship of equals, there is no room for worship, only mutual recognition. High-value men are not drawn to blind praise. They are drawn to clear-eyed admiration, rooted in standards. They respect women who can see them as they are, strengths, flaws, potential, and still engage from a place of inner stability, not infatuation. When validation becomes constant, it loses its meaning. Worse, it becomes performative, a kind of emotional currency traded for attention rather than a reflection of true connection.